Now, in putting together my comments for this evening, I noticed that there's something a little different about preparing for this class in the last few weeks than had been the case for a few years before that. I didn't necessarily have to wait till the very last minute to avoid being scooped. And some of the things I could talk about seem relatively mundane. They're more normal politics. I actually enjoy that, and I hope you might as well. I have 9 topics that I want to get through tonight, if time permits, but most of them will be very brief. The one I want to spend the most time on is the one I'd like to discuss first, and that's the president's speech to the joint session of Congress week before last, which in all but name was a State of the Union address. It filled the functions of that kind of speech. It celebrated accomplishments of the recent past. In President Biden's case, the first 100 days of his term, and it laid out the major legislative initiatives on which he was seeking support from the Congress and by extension from the American people to urge their members of Congress to support. This, by the way, is a change in the State of the Union address. If you go back and read some old ones, 19th century ones, the speech is a department by department review of the activities of the government. The Agriculture Department was allocated this much money, and it conducted this many experiments and sent out this many packets of free seeds, and it has a surplus at the end of the year of such and such amount, and they were deadly dull. But in the television age, they've been refashioned so that they focus on major legislative initiatives and proposals. Mr. Biden devoted his primary emphasis to social and economic proposals that aimed to provide an economic stimulus and to help the transformation of the economy from a manufacturing economy to a service and technology economy, to build a stronger middle class, thereby not incidentally trying to reclaim the traditional support of the middle class for his own party. And in the course of doing those two things, also to redress historic inequities in the distribution of resources and benefits. Now, the message reflected a number of key strategic decisions that President Biden made, and I want to highlight some of these. One was obviously to go big. He proposed over $4 trillion of new spending. Now, granted, it was on multiple projects and over multiple years, but it was of a scope that you would have to go back probably to the New Deal era to find. Second decision was not to submit lots and lots of individual bills, but to package his proposals in 2 omnibus measures. So that if you were to look at the breakdown of what he proposed, there's a lot of different things under one heading and a lot of different things under another heading, but there's only 2 major headings. And one of them was titled Jobs, the American Jobs Plan, and the other one was titled the American Family Plan. And these are parallel to the American Rescue Plan, which is the $1.9 trillion of COVID relief that the Congress had passed at near the very beginning of his term. The choice of the terms jobs and family as the key terms is not accidental. These are both very positive terms that politicians of all sides claim to support. So if Mr. Biden could succeed in getting an understanding of jobs and a family that matched up with his proposals, he would be starting on the path to what he hoped to do, which was to get unity of support. The only other major example that I can think of this kind of packaging of legislation was the war on poverty during President Johnson's administration, where several different proposals were put together as different parts of the Economic Opportunity Act although the scale was minuscule compared to what Biden has just proposed. Another key decision was to take the term infrastructure and expand the scope of the term from its traditional meaning. Now, if you go back, if you look up in the dictionary for the meaning of infrastructure, you'll find something like permanent installations that are necessary for military campaigns. And of course, the term has been stretched beyond that to refer to the underlying foundations of the American economy and society. We've thought of them in terms of construction projects in recent years, but President Biden not only encompassed those within the term, but extended the term to a range of human applications, care for elders, pre-kindergarten, and so on. And he thereby invited discussion, which the Republican Party was eager to take up, about the meaning of infrastructure, which, if you think about it, is in some ways tangential to the question of whether the programs are good and ought to be supported or not. It's a diversion, whether you call them this or call them that. But certainly what Biden did is a reasonable construal of infrastructure and its analogs. Originally, he had proposed to put all this in one package, decided to separate it in two, one of which was presented before the other, on the theory, I believe, that one of the bills was easier to pass than the other, that the infrastructure bill, the American Jobs Plan, would be easier to pass than the American Family Plan, and passing one could help add to the momentum for passing the other. I suspect that's the reason for doing it in the way that he did. He also made a choice about how to fund this plan. He didn't fund it just through deficit spending, as he had with the American Rescue Plan, and as President Trump had done with a number of his initiatives, but he proposed to fund the infrastructure plan by raising corporate tax rates and closing corporate tax loopholes that allowed many corporations to escape paying taxes altogether. What he proposed to do was to restore half of the cut that the Congress and the president in 2017 had made in the corporate tax rate when they took it from 35% down to 21%. He proposed to raise it back up to 28%. The American Family Plan, he proposed to fund by increasing taxes on the top 1% of income earners, the very top bracket, by taking that bracket back up to the rate that it had been at during Bill Clinton's administration through Barack Obama's administration, from 37 to 39.6%, increasing the enforcement of the IRS to collect taxes that have been owed but not paid, and some other related measures as well. And the final and perhaps most interesting choice that he made in this speech, given that he wants to attract some Republican support, is to challenge directly one of the key principles, one of the key economic principles supported by Republican presidents, namely that if you cut taxes at the top, the effect will trickle down and benefit the entire economy. And you may remember in President Biden's speech, he said explicitly and directly, trickle-down economics has never worked. And his contrast, as he described it, was to grow the economy from the bottom and from the middle out. And that's part of his direct appeal to the middle class. Now, not surprisingly, this proposal is encountering and will encounter some serious challenges. One of the ones that might not have been expected has come from a number of progressive Democrats from high tax states, mostly in the Northeast. And theirs is an attempt to try to link together Biden's proposal with undoing one of the measures that was in the 2017 tax legislation. That's the cap on state and local tax deductions from federal taxes. This was an incredibly shrewd move when it was adopted because it worked with almost surgical precision to target high income earners in high tax states that, not coincidentally, were predominantly blue states because they were governed by administrations that believed in delivering a fairly high level of public services. And so the change that was made was to place a $10,000 limit on the amount of state and local taxes, income or sales taxes and real estate taxes, that could be deducted from one's federal income tax. Well, this group of progressive Democrats said pretty directly that they would oppose the Biden jobs plan and the Biden family plan unless the financing also included a repeal of this limitation on state and local taxes. Now, if the limitation were repealed, what it would mean is that there would be a hole in the financing that would have to be made up in some other fashion. And President Biden's position was, I'll be glad to consider that if you can propose a sensible way to make up the revenue loss. And that's sort of where that stands. The more predictable challenge has come from Republicans who fairly consistently are concerned about the high level of the federal deficit and the accumulated national debt whenever a Democrat is in office. They took that position during the Clinton administration, during the Obama administration. They suspended it during the George W. Bush administration and the Trump administration, and they're taking it again. This is too much money. These are big spending socialists, and this is not what the people want. And that's a fairly predictable response. Now, let me digress for just a second to remind us that at the end of last week, the Labor Department released the jobs report for April. And it showed that the growth in the number of jobs in the month of April was much, much smaller than economists had predicted. It was about 250,000 new jobs, where the predictions had been in the order of 1 million jobs. Republicans seized upon this report to conclude that the reason there hadn't been more job growth was that Congress had been too generous in providing supplemental unemployment insurance benefits of an additional $300 a week. And that meant that people weren't going out and seeking work because they could make more money by sitting at home and collecting this $300 a week supplement in their unemployment insurance. I know of no evidence that supported this argument one way or another, and the supplemental unemployment insurance is scheduled to run out by September at the latest. So I think it is unlikely. But that was a side issue that colored Republican criticism of the new Biden proposals because they were seen as more of the same, of providing unnecessary spending, giving excess money to individuals with the result that it would hurt the economy. Now, back to the main topic. Biden rather obviously called for bipartisan support for these two new measures. And it's a fair question what he means by bipartisan support, because he's also said to the Republicans, I will listen to your ideas, but I'm not going to wait forever. And I'll get to that in a minute. I think he's got two different meanings of bipartisanship, and he's playing both of them. His preferred meaning, of course, would be to have 10 or more Senate Republicans and probably 25 or more House Republicans sign on and support these bills. so that they would pass with the requisite number of votes to avoid a filibuster. At the moment, it doesn't appear that that's too likely to happen. So his fallback understanding of bipartisanship, which he's also pushing, is that he means support from significant numbers of Republicans as measured by public opinion polling. And there he's in the fortunate position of finding that the measures contained within this jobs plan and family plan are broadly popular with the American people. Unlike Obamacare when it was being proposed, these are broadly popular with the American people, including, in most cases, a majority, sometimes a significant majority of Republicans. So he's trying to suggest that the Republican members of the Senate and House are really out of touch with their own party. And what he's doing has the support of both Democrats and Republicans in the population, and therefore is bipartisan. The proposals have a framework of underlying assumptions, and there really are two of them that both came out in his speech. One is economic nationalism. In this respect, he's probably more similar to Trump than would have been expected. He suggests that Buy American ought to be our slogan, and it should be the device by which we will bring back manufacturing. You remember in the speech, he said there's no reason why we can't manufacture such and such and such in Pittsburgh rather than in Beijing. And he made that same kind of contrast a couple of other times. Now, I remind you that in President Trump's inaugural address, his theme was Buy American and Hire American. And Biden, in effect, is arguing the same thing in this section of the speech. The other underlying framework that came out very clearly in the speech is that we're in a serious competition with China. And he defines that as a social and economic competition rather than a military competition. But that competition provides a challenge to the country. And I think he hopes it will be the means by which he will unite a significant amount of the country. It's sort of analogous to President Kennedy's proposal that we'll put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Why? Because it's hard. And this challenge will organize us and unite us around an important objective. But not only that, the competition with China gives a sense of urgency to getting these proposals in place and ramping up so that we can hold our own in that competition. And in that context, partisan bickering and delays are not acceptable. He said at one point that he wanted significant action from Congress by Memorial Day. We'll see if he gets it or how close he comes to that. Now, currently, it appears that these measures are at something of an impasse. On the one hand, there's no reason to think that they will get the 60 votes in the Senate that they need to avoid a filibuster. On the other hand, there's no reason to think that the president has the support of all 50 Democrats, which he would need to try to push these measures through using the reconciliation tactics and strategies. Both Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Sinema of Arizona, both Democrats, have said they would oppose going to reconciliation with these measures, at least until there was a legitimate good faith effort made to seek support from Republican members of the Senate. So at the moment, we're at an impasse, but there's possible ways through it, and there are possibilities of negotiating this. And I think when President Biden says he'll listen to all ideas, I think he means it. And I think he would legitimately welcome some sorts of Republican ideas. Now, what he's made clear that he won't welcome are Republican ideas that say scrap the whole thing, or Republican ideas that say let's spend about 5 to 10% of what you propose, or Republican ideas that say we will only think about roads and bridges and maybe broadband internet as infrastructure, and none of this other stuff is legitimately included. But it seems to me that he's made clear he's willing to consider changes in the mix of the proposals. He's willing to consider more of this, less of that. He's made quite clear that he's willing to consider tinkering with the funding mechanism. For example, there are a few Republicans who've said they might consider an increase in the capital gain in the corporate income tax to 25%, but not to 28%. Well, Biden's original proposal was to spend the money over 8 years, but to raise it over 15 years, which incidentally has implications for the deficit along the way that he's not highlighting particularly. But he's made clear that he's open to lowering the tax increase and spreading the funding out over a longer period, for example. He's open to at least considering alternative taxes rather than the ones that he originally identified if they accomplish the same work. He's certainly willing to consider, or at least I think he's willing to consider, breaking up the omnibus nature of these proposals and having a larger number of separate bills, if not having each program in a separate bill, on the theory that there may be a floating majority, that different members of Congress would support different components of this in such a fashion that he could build majorities of different people for the different parts of the plan. That may be a little bit optimistic. One possible outcome, it seems to me, might be to go after the low-hanging fruit first. That's the traditionally understood infrastructure, the repair of highways and bridges and maybe broadband internet, and then convince Manchin and Sinema that that's as far as the Republicans will ever be willing to go. And the only way that we can do the other parts that they may support and that their states may benefit from is at that point to go to reconciliation. But I'm about as good at predicting legislative strategy as I am predicting election results. Well, that's probably the major topic that's currently on the table. I want now to talk about a different kind of topic. This one has the virtue of being very current. It's going to happen tomorrow. Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming will be stripped of her number 3 leadership role in the Republican caucus, I predict, by a fairly large majority in favor of Representative Elise Stefanik of New York. Why? Well, Representative Cheney, who I'm sure everybody knows is the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, Representative Cheney was one of 10 members of the House of Representatives who voted to impeach President Trump. That's not her offense, the party leadership claims. And indeed, she held on to her position in a kind of vote of confidence after she voted to impeach President Trump. That's not her offense. Her offense is keeping it up, is persisting in the denunciation of the former president's false claims that the election was stolen from him and that there was widespread fraud. Claims which, according to the polls, about 70% of Republicans now believe. She's argued vigorously against those claims, said that they're false, said that the party must move on beyond that. And that's the reason that she's being challenged for her position. Now, interestingly, Liz Cheney is a much more solid conservative ideologically than is Congresswoman Stefanik. But Congresswoman Stefanik has tied herself to President Trump. And she's been endorsed by him, endorsed by Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Minority Whip Steve Scalise, the number 1 and number 2 leaders of the conference. And support for her this time around has been sparse indeed. And from what I've noticed, at least, has been limited to some of the other 10 Republicans who voted for impeachment. Now, those who are not Republicans could look at this and say, fine, a plague on both your houses. Why don't you and you go fight? But regardless of one's partisan identity, there is a larger significance to this particular controversy. When the Republicans lost the presidency, the House, and the Senate, it was widely predicted that there would be something of an internal struggle. Civil war was a term often used, something of an internal struggle for the soul of the party. How is it going to move on beyond President Trump? Well, it seems to me that this situation tells us, number one, there's not going to be any civil war. It's already been held and it's over with. And Trump clearly retains his hold on the party, and the members of the Republican Party, at least the office holders of the Republican Party, remain firmly in his corner, firmly allied to him. The party has made a decision that fealty to Trump outweighs commitment to ideological principle. And that means that there will be some shrinking of the base of the Republican Party, but that what remains will be more pure and may be able to drive turnout more effectively. Well, that's enough about Liz Cheney. Topic 3, efforts that are underway in a number of states to limit access to the vote. That's about the most neutral way that I can describe them. Laws have been passed or proposed in Georgia, Iowa, Florida, Texas, and possibly other states. If not, I'm sure there are others that will follow. The purpose of these laws depends upon who you ask. If you ask committed Republicans, and the proponents of these measures are Republicans, if you ask them, they would say it is an attempt to protect against the risk of vote fraud, to which mail-in ballots, early voting, and drop-off ballot boxes are especially susceptible. Now, let me note, as I understand this controversy, it does not require them to ground their belief in the fact that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump, although holders of those two beliefs often do tend to run together. But you can imagine support for these proposals based simply on the greater use of mail-in, early voting, and drop-off boxes, and the unchecked or unpoliced nature of those particular means of voting that make them more susceptible to fraud, so that preemptively we want to try to protect ourselves. From the standpoint of the Democrats who oppose these measures, the purpose of them is self-evidently deliberate voter suppression, especially voters of color, excuse me, who in 2020 made much greater use of these means of voting than did others, and may have been a large part of the explanation for the increased turnout in 2020. Well, what are the things that have been proposed? Photo ID requirements, signature matching, no sending out of absentee ballots or even absentee ballot applications until the prospective voter requests them, limited early voting hours, shifting power from election officials to partisan poll watchers who can challenge votes at the polls, restricted number of drop boxes, disallowing drive-through voting, which was used in Harris County, Texas, and Houston, and prohibiting offering water or food to those waiting in line to vote, which was one of the Georgia measures that was approved. It appears that protest demonstrations against these measures are having no effect in limiting them, and threats of economic boycott or reprisals by powerful corporations located within the states involved are not making much difference either. Now I'm going to go out on a limb and predict court decisions. I think that these state level efforts in general are probably legal. First of all, the Constitution gives the states the power to determine the method of choosing their electors. As we talked about during the fall campaign, there's no overriding federal right or constitutional right to vote. So I think they're likely to be ruled legal for that reason. And furthermore, the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby County versus Holder case of 2013 declared illegal the section of the Voting Rights Act that previously had required that changes such as these made by states that had a history of voter discrimination, including several of the ones that have passed these laws, were unconstitutional, were illegal. And the reason for the court's decision was that there was no provision in the Voting Rights Act for updating the list of states that it would apply to as conditions changed. And while the Supreme Court said that Congress could certainly repair this deficiency by updating the statute, a closely divided Congress has not done that. In fact, neither the House nor the Senate has done that. Now, the problem with Congress attempting to remedy this deficiency, which is the purpose of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that neither the House nor the Senate has voted upon, which proposes a new way to determine which states would have pre-clearance requirements. The difficulty is there's solid Republican opposition to it. And it's not subject to reconciliation. It has nothing to do with the budget. So it would need 60 votes. And as it appears now, there's no way it's going to get 60 votes. There's even less of a likelihood, in my opinion, that Congress will pass, or that the Senate will pass specifically, the House already has, the For the People Act, H.R. 1, which is also an omnibus measure that includes several things, such as mandated early voting for at least 15 days, same-day registration, automatic registration, enfranchisement of felons when their term of incarceration is up, nonpartisan redistricting, and so forth. That's been passed by the House, but again, where the 10 Republican votes are going to come from in the Senate, I personally cannot imagine. The only path I see through is to change the filibuster requirements so that 60 votes are not required. Now, at the moment, Senators Manchin and Sinema are not prepared to do that either. I think if anything happens, it's not going to be elimination of the filibuster. It will be some kind of carve out that says that legislation of a particular kind that would include these voting protections is not subject to the filibuster. I started off imagining a carve out that would say protections of constitutional rights are not subject to the filibuster, but then I reminded myself, hey, there is no constitutional right to vote. That's one of the defects in our Constitution as it currently stands. Well, before I leave this topic, let me just note that there may be an ironic outcome when all is said and done. These voting limitation measures may end up hurting Republicans in two ways. First, prior to the pandemic, rural voters who were predominantly Republican were the greatest users of mail-in voting, or among the greatest users of mail-in voting. They didn't stop using mail-in voting. They were just swamped in 2020 by pandemic-related mail-in voting. So Republicans could be hurting themselves. And the second way in which they could be is Latino and Latina voters for whom Republicans are trying to compete made much greater use of mail-in voting in 2020 than they had in the past. And if that continues, there will be a difficulty for the Republicans. That's a segue to the next topic, which is the 2020 census, the preliminary results of which were released a couple weeks ago. The final figures are coming in August or September. And it'll be on the basis of those final figures that all states will redistrict their House apportionment. But there are a number of changes in congressional representation and in electoral vote. 7 states will each lose a member of Congress and 1 electoral vote. Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, West Virginia, and California. All except California have one thing in common, or have a couple of things in common. They're Midwest states, originally heavily manufacturing, where manufacturing has declined, population growth has slowed, and in a couple of cases like Illinois and West Virginia, there has actually been a net loss of population compared to 2010. The gainers, Texas gains 2 more congressional districts. Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Montana, and Oregon each gain 1. Now, if you took those new apportionments and mapped them on the 2020 election, President Biden would have still won decisively, but with 3 fewer electoral votes, than he received, 303 rather than 306. So to that degree, you could say, well, the Republican imbalance in the Electoral College has been slightly strengthened. But of course, the flaw in that analysis is the numbers will not stay the same when every state conducts its redistricting to make sure that its congressional districts are of approximately similar population. For example, let's take Illinois. Illinois will lose 1 seat. Given the partisan makeup of the Illinois legislature and the fact that it's the legislature, not an independent commission, that districts Illinois, I can assure you that the seat that is lost will be one of the 5 seats that is currently held by a Republican. And it probably should be, because the downstate area that is Republican controlled is where the greatest population loss has come. In addition, I can assure you that the Democrats conducting the redistricting will try as hard as they can to take at least 1 district that's currently represented by a Republican and change its boundaries around in a little bit, such that by a small margin, it's likely to be represented by a Democrat. So that Illinois, which now has 13 Democrats and 5 Republicans in the House, could well end up with 14 Democrats and 3 Republicans instead. And you could do the reverse of that with respect to states that are heavily Republican, and there are more of them that are predominantly Republican or where Republicans control all parts of the government. One of the reasons that the For the People Act includes a mandate to have nonpartisan commissions do the redistricting is to avoid shenanigans like that and to avoid the extremes of partisan gerrymandering. Meanwhile, the Census Bureau reports that there was the slowest rate of population growth in the US in this 10-year period in a long time. And the reason may be that the census resulted in an undercount, and that's quite likely to have happened when you consider the changes to the counting that were imposed by the pandemic and by the extension and then withdrawal of an extension of deadline to make the count. The Census Bureau had estimated, based on various midterm samples that it takes, that the US population would come out at 333 and some million. It came out 2 million less than that. And if their estimates were accurate, it means there were at least 2 million or so uncounted Americans, and those were not randomly distributed. And that has an effect on the allocation of a number of categories of federal grants. Now I want to switch to a difficult topic, not that these were easy, but the continuing concern about police practices, and particularly the shooting of unarmed Blacks by members of the police. 2 weeks ago today, or 3 weeks ago today, Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder in the case of George Floyd's death. This was a very unusual verdict. There are few convictions of police officers in this kind of a situation because both by law and norm, there's widespread deference to the judgment made by police officers in split-second situations. One of the things that was unusual about the Minneapolis case is it was not a split-second shooting, as many of the cases have been, but a case in which Officer Chauvin, as you know, held his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes, including after he stopped breathing and was unresponsive. So it was much easier in this case than it normally is to satisfy the legal requirements for a conviction for murder. And it may be for that reason that a number of people, both officials and non-officials, expressed their delight at the verdict, not having listened to the case or to the arguments. And that has larger implications for the ability of a person to get a fair trial. Although I think the appeals by Mr. Chauvin's legal counsel that he did not get a fair trial in the case are very unlikely to stand up. It's interesting that concurrently with this, and I think showing much more promise than this, the Justice Department has announced investigations of police practice in both Minneapolis and Louisville in response to the George Floyd and the Breonna Taylor killings by police. These were announced by Attorney General Merrick Garland within about a week or so of each other. And it's these Justice Department investigations that have the potential to result in consent decrees, which have the potential to result in changes in police practice that are more longstanding and fundamental. And we'll see what happens in that case. Now, for another difficult topic, although I'm going to take up only a little slice of it, immigration reform. This topic became prominent again when there was a surge of unaccompanied minors trying to cross the southwestern border between Mexico and the United States, swamping available facilities for them and requiring hasty search for substitute locations where they could be held until they could be reunited with their families, which has happened, by the way, at a fairly rapid pace. The causes of this problem, according to Republican critics of the president, the main cause was Biden's signaling that he was going to follow a more humane policy than Trump, which invited the surge. According to Biden, the cause of the problem was a periodic occurrence that was caused primarily by economic and safety factors in the Central American nations from which most of the migrants originated. In other words, Biden stresses push factors as the cause. The Republican critics stressed pull factors as the cause. There has been a dramatic decline in the numbers staying in jail-like conditions and in the number of days that they've had to wait until they could be placed. Republicans have announced that they're going to make this a major issue in the 2022 midterms. I'm a little skeptical that they'll accomplish much if they do. The moment for making it an issue may have passed, especially if the numbers continue to improve. Beyond that, it will invite comparison to the very unpopular practice of separating children from their parents during the Trump administration. And it will be hard to argue that that was a sounder or more humane approach. And besides, the fact that jobs right now are going begging for takers makes it hard to argue that immigration needs to be tightly controlled or immigrants will take jobs away from Americans. Now, Biden, on his first day in office, submitted to Congress an immigration reform proposal that emphasizes a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who are already in the country. That so far is not going anywhere either. But I think its best prospects will be if it's divided up and parts of it are passed in succession, beginning with the Dreamers, for whom there's widespread approval of providing for a pathway for citizenship. The Dreamers, of course, are people who came to the country illegally as young children who've grown up here, who've been law-abiding here, and who've never known any other country. So far, I've been talking about domestic policy, and I don't want to totally exclude foreign policy, where there are three key developments I want to highlight. One is the climate summit that President Biden convened a week or so ago. It was a successful diplomatic initiative, and it enhanced U.S. pledges for reductions of carbon emissions. But there was a fair amount of suspicion regarding the seriousness and especially the longevity of American commitments. If they can go back and forth, depending on who the president is in office, then are they really durable commitments to climate change? Well, Biden's in the position of having to make good on those commitments. And so far, other nations have not rushed to join him in making specific pledges, but they have, including China, which is probably the most important country in this respect. They have pledged to return to planning together to control the climate change. The second foreign policy development was the president's announcement that all American troops will be withdrawn from Afghanistan by September 11th. Trump had proposed this by May 1st, and Biden's action, aside from the logistically related delay, is fairly similar to what Trump had proposed. This may illustrate that some things are appropriate even if Trump is the one who proposes them. Now, there was a fig leaf of an agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government that the Trump administration negotiated to try to assure that the American withdrawal would not result in a bloodbath. It is highly likely that this agreement will be ignored and that there will not be even the decent interval that Henry Kissinger claimed to have provided for in Vietnam at the time that American forces withdrew from Vietnam. The central argument for withdrawal has been that for 20 years, the U.S. has done what it could, and what the record indicates is all that the U.S. has been able to do is to plug its finger in the dike and preserve a stalemate in Afghanistan without producing any greater stability in the Afghan government that we were supposedly trying to help. My prediction is that this withdrawal will happen, that it will be messy, that the situation in Afghanistan will deteriorate, that attempts will be made to blame the American withdrawal for the deteriorating situation, but that those claims will not be widely accepted, because I think there's an underlying feeling that 20 years of commitment has been enough. And when we finally pulled out from Vietnam, the recriminations from that were relatively limited. And then the final foreign policy topic I want to mention is the attempt to resurrect the Iranian nuclear deal, despite the strong opposition from Israel. Indirect talks are now underway, with the European signatories to the deal transmitting messages back and forth between the Iranians and the Americans. Based on what's been in the newspapers, it seems to me that a return to the original deal is now pretty likely if both sides decide they really want for that to happen. But both sides have divergent notions of what they want to do beyond restoring the original deal. Biden has said it must be followed up immediately with further negotiations to limit missile power and terrorism and other threats that Iran might pose that were deliberately left out of the original deal. Iran wants a very comprehensive removal of American sanctions while preserving at least some of the enhancements to its nuclear capacity that it put in place after Trump withdrew from the deal. How that will all work out, or if it will, is anybody's guess. One of the unstated assumptions of the Obama administration in making the original deal, which had a 15-year time period, was that during those 15 years, enough confidence building measures would take place that by the end of those 15 years, Iran and the United States would be willing to make further negotiations and extend the reduction of the nuclear threat. That currently has not happened. Since I mentioned Israel, I don't want to overlook the fact that there was another Israeli election that ended as inconclusively as the three previous ones. Neither Netanyahu's coalition nor the opposing coalition has been able to put together a majority of the seats in the Knesset. Netanyahu's time ran out. The opposition, led by Yair Lapid, is currently trying to put together a government. The interesting difference this time is that the opposition to the Trump faction is ideologically incoherent. It ranges from the left to the right and is united only by the opposition to Netanyahu continuing in office, particularly while he's under indictment. And that raises the serious question whether that coalition will be able to put together anything resembling a majority in the Knesset. It's at least 4 seats short. If not, then the likelihood is there will be yet a 5th general election that will take place sometime late summer. Final topic I want to address tonight, and for those of you that have been counting, this is number 9, anticipating the 2022 midterm elections, which people are already beginning to talk about. Historically, the party that controls the presidency loses seats in the midterm election. There are only a few exceptions to that, like 1934, 1962, and 2002. But Congress is so evenly divided that there are no seats anybody can afford to lose. A shift of 1 seat in the Senate will determine who controls the Senate. A shift of 5 seats or 6 seats in the House of Representatives will flip control in the House. The likely Republican playbook, I think, based on what we've seen so far, will be to double down on Trump's lies regarding the 2020 election results and to decry the Democrats as favoring out-of-control spending and socialism. That approach dictates an appeal to mobilize the party base. Although that is shrinking, the key is turning out the base on election day for the midterms. Concerned Democrats are contending that democracy itself is on the ballot in 2022, by which they're referring to traditions of majority rule, identifying with a common community, decreasing polarization, and a commitment to the notion that nobody eviscerates the other. There are no final victories in politics. In the Senate, the most vulnerable Democrats are Raphael Warnock and Mark Kelly, who just won special elections and must run again, and Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, who won the first time around with a margin of only about 1,000 votes. The most vulnerable Republican seats are those occupied by retiring senators Toomey of Pennsylvania, Portman of Ohio, Burr of North Carolina, and Blunt of Missouri. In the House, a few Democrats are giving up probably safe seats to run for the Senate or for state office, and the Democrats will need a major campaign effort to reverse the normal tendency to lose seats. My prediction as of now, the Democrats will slightly expand their numbers in the Senate, going to 52 or 53, which will put Manchin and Sinema in a position of somewhat less influence, but the Republicans are likely to take control of the House. And that likelihood is an additional reason for President Biden, with his eyes on the clock, to enlist the theme of urgency in behalf of getting his proposals adopted and going big early, as he appears to be doing. And with that, I'll stop. As usual, I've gone on for too long, but I'd like to ask Marcy to recognize people with comments or questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. We have a good 30 minutes left.
Sure, I think, is that Mark? You're muted.
Okay. David, this may be a little too current, but with the attack on the pipeline, either by the Russian outlaw gang or the Russian Foreign Service, it remains to be seen. Republicans wasted no time somehow blaming Biden for the lack of cybersecurity in the United States. But this is an area where traditionally, I think, the two parties would have come together on some kind of legislation. But given the Republican overall strategy, is even this going to be an area of cooperation?
Well, as you suggest, it's too soon to know. I think it's interesting that the response that Biden has taken is not to seek legislation, but to issue an executive order. And that probably reflects the reality that you have described. But I don't know. One would think that it would be an area that would transcend political division.
If I don't see you, feel free to unmute and say hello. Carl?
Well, reluctantly, I wonder if David wants to comment on what's happening in Israel and Gaza.
Well, I thought about whether I want to comment on that. It has to do with a very different kind of politics than what I've been describing. The underlying issue is a combination of property rights in dispute combined with an openly avowed desire to populate East Jerusalem with sufficient number of Jews that it could not become the capital of any future Palestinian state. I guess I would say this is the kind of thing that happens when you don't accept the premise of no final victories. When you take it that the task of one side or of the other side is to eviscerate its opponent and bring about the ultimate utopia that you're striving for. And of course, you deceive yourself that that's your purpose by claiming you're responding defensively to what the other side has done. And there's all kinds of potential for escalation in that, unless there's some responsible intervention to stop it. Now, beyond that, I don't know what I could usefully say.
Just that David usually welcomes comments as well as questions.
Of course.
Mark again, there you go.
As long as it was so quiet, David, there had been talk of bringing back earmarks as a way of trying to generate some kind of bipartisan Republican support for certain things, because they would have their skin in the game by putting in their own earmarks. That seems to have died. given the way the Republicans have said this is all out war on Biden. I don't see that changing. Do you?
It might. I don't think it's been rejected. I think the discussion of it has kind of died down in recent weeks. But I think there is a strong logic to that, and there's a strong self-interest on the part of members of Congress to bring goodies for their districts that may particularly come into play if they anticipate being in closer re-election contests than they've sometimes had. So I think it might well come back. And I must say, I think it makes sense given that safeguards are added into it to control some of the worst abuses of earmarks, like secret earmarks. I mean, it sounds kind of backward to say this, but I think the return of earmarks could be a move to make Congress far more collegial and congenial and willing to cooperate.
Like Greta, Michael.
It's Joel.
It's Joel, but that's
Oh.
okay. The issue of the filibuster, for me at least, is a rather complex one. There's a very compelling argument at the moment for abolishing it so that Biden can get certain things done. But certainly in past administrations, the Democrats have succeeded in using the filibuster to prevent things that they didn't want. What is your take on the filibuster in general, not just specifically in terms of its impact on current politics?
Well, I approach the topic somewhat gingerly because it is complex. First of all, we have to realize what the origins of the filibuster were. And the origins of the filibuster were to make it possible to make it impossible for Congress to pass civil rights legislation. The filibuster was used rarely. It was an active filibuster. You couldn't just signal your intent to filibuster and then go do something else. You had to actually occupy the floor and talk so that there was real skin in the game. It had sordid origins. It is anti-majoritarian by definition and by design. And those factors all predisposed me against it. On the other hand, I realized that the object of the design of the government was not to make it as efficient as possible, but rather to create sufficient obstacles to doing things that the proposals would be well considered and properly acted upon, and where a supermajority was deemed essential, that a supermajority could be obtained. And those are legitimate concerns, but they're abused in the practice when everything requires 60 votes and when a filibuster is not a real filibuster. So as I say, I approach the topic gingerly. I would be more disposed to what I described as a carve out from the filibuster, which is what they've done for cabinet nominees and judicial nominees. They've in effect said those things are not subject to the filibuster. And the admittedly cumbersome reconciliation process is a way to say, well, if necessary, budget measures can be separate from the filibuster. I think if there's a way to find a satisfactory carve out, and I don't know exactly what it would be, that would be a more appealing way to me to cut through the complexity of the filibuster issue than an out and out elimination of it, which likely as not will have unintended consequences whenever the opposite party is in control or whenever the control changes from one party to another.
And Bob.
More or less a legal question on economics. Employment. There are about 8 or 9 states right now that want to opt out of the, since it's, the job openings have, increased, that want to opt out of the federal plan to extend the $300 benefit till September 4th. Can they do that?
I don't know. I don't know. You've got me. I'm not familiar enough with the specific terms of the law, of that law, to know whether it's discretionary or obligatory.
Okay.
Thoughts, comments?
No one's asked me yet about the Electoral College. That seems to come up every one of these sessions.
Somebody wondering about that?
Nope.
No.
Well, I don't see how it would ever get abolished, because not enough, too many states get a benefit from it to keep from having the 3/4 vote to abolish it. That's precisely the problem. All the little states get outsized advantages by keeping it. So I don't see how that's ever going to happen.
That's my position exactly.
Jackie? Do you want to unmute? There you go.
I did unmute. I do have a question actually about the Electoral College.
Uh-oh.
I have two parts. First, how are they selected? And I recall during the election that I guess, I'm not quite sure, and you can correct me if they were the electoral judges or whatever, when somebody was casting a vote, they would say, I pass, or I submit, or I will give somebody, the next person, maybe 30 seconds of my vote, or for add it onto their vote. Do you understand what I'm trying to ask about how they do that and give some people like 3 minutes to talk and some people like 30 seconds extra to talk?
I think you may be confusing the Electoral College with the certification of the vote by Congress, which is
Oh,
where
okay.
the speeches occurred. The Electoral College are the 538 individuals that actually cast the state's vote for president. They meet in the state capitol on a designated day in September. They fill out forms, they put them in an official envelope, and it's transmitted to the House of Representatives. Who those 538 people are, they're typically selected by the party leadership in the state, so that on election day, or whenever you cast your ballot, on your ballot it said you're voting for Biden and Harris, or you're voting for Trump and Pence, or whoever else might have been on the ballot. But that's a fiction. In reality, you're voting for the electors, in our case, 20 electors who are pledged to cast their vote for Biden, Harris, or for Trump, Pence, or whomever. Some states legally require the electors to cast their votes for the person who won the majority in the state. Other states do not require it. And we have a long history of so-called faithless electors who cast their vote for somebody else who didn't win the popular vote in their state. We had none of them this time. But in 2016, there were 5 faithless Clinton electors and 2 faithless Trump electors. And that was an unusually high number. But the members of the Electoral College are the people that are actually chosen to meet in the state capitol and cast the state's votes. That vote has to be certified by the Congress meeting in joint session in Washington in January. And that's what was televised, and that's what became so controversial because of the simultaneous insurrection at the Capitol. So
Thank you.
that's where people were giving speeches of different lengths.
Oh, thank you so much for clarifying, and it was a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who was that? Kathy.
Ed, Ed, and then Bob.
David, concerning North Korea, it seems to me that the idea the quaint idea that they will ever give up their nuclear weapons that they have worked so hard to get. I know you're not if you had the answer, you would send it to Washington. But what kinds of, it seems a pipe dream the way people talk about. I want before we negotiate, you have to give up your nuclear weapons. What other tactics do you see that might work with him?
Well, you have to define what you mean by work. If what you mean by work is get them to give up their nuclear weapons, I'm very pessimistic that anything would.
No, I would just be more like, so that we don't have to worry about them nuking South Korea or something.
Well, then the question is, how could you coax them into being a more responsible nuclear power?
Right.
I'm hesitant to say like India and Pakistan, because I don't know about that. I don't have any answer for you. I mean, that's obviously what diplomacy is about. And the question is, what incentives might they have to behave responsibly? How could that structure of incentives be changed? Well, obviously one incentive that they have is if they use nuclear weapons, they'll be promptly annihilated. And I would think that would count for something, even for people that are not normally considered rational by our standards. But beyond that, I don't know what to say.
Question on a topic has been up, Washington, D.C., statehood. Do you ever think that'll happen? And they have a representative, but she has like limited voting powers.
She has no voting powers.
Yeah, no
I
vote,
believe.
but she's there, but has really nothing to do. So what do you think is going to happen, maybe?
I don't think it's going to go through unless there's drastic change in the composition of the Senate. Interestingly, I saw over the weekend an issue that I had not considered related to it. The proposal to make Washington, D.C. a state exempts an area that includes the Capitol, the White House, the National Mall, I think some stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue. There are about 80 people that live in that piece of land that would be exempted from the state. According to the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, those living in the national capital cast 3 electoral votes. That would be in addition to the votes of the new state. In order to avoid that, the 23rd Amendment would have to be repealed concurrently with making Washington, D.C. a state. I don't know. I don't think that anybody's disposed to support that.
To just ends this.
I'm sorry?
Seymour.
David, since we're close to 9 o'clock, could you take a few minutes to give us a preview of the book that will be published soon under your authorship?
It was actually published in March. So
it's available.
It exists and it's available. You can order it on Amazon. What I do is I go through the contextual background, the immediate background, the development of that March 31st speech, the three key announcements that are in it and how they work together, and how speech making and policy making each drove the other during the Johnson administration. For those that don't remember this speech, and I suspect some of us have vivid memories of it and some have none, this was the speech in which Johnson announced that he would not be a candidate for re-election. That's about all that most people remember about the speech. But that came at the very end of a 45-minute speech, most of which was about Vietnam, in which arguably he was announcing major changes in American policy toward Vietnam that set us on a course toward de-escalation. But every one of those announcements is highly ambiguous and could be interpreted as continuity or as change, as celebration of success or acknowledgement of failure. And a large part of that was strategic for the construction of the speech in a particular way. And that's what I traced in the book. The speech went through 11 different drafts over an 11-day period. And the drafting process reflected some active disagreements among Johnson's advisors, and the balance of forces among them shifted about halfway through the drafting process. And so I talk about that and what the shifts were and how and why Johnson adopted them and sort of how it all fit together.
Okay.
Thank you.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam and the Presidency, the Speech of March 31, 1968. Published by Texas A&M University Press. Available on Amazon.
We'll try to get all that out into the publicity as we start to put it out right after Shavuot.
Okay.
Okay.
Mark, I think that's your hand up. Mark, yeah.
David, thank you for a broad brush analysis. And I each time you talk, it seems that there are more Republicans, I think you got to 70% tonight, who are willing to accept the results of the election and don't believe that there was widespread fraud. And
no, I said the opposite. I
Oh.
said 70% believe the election results were illegitimate.
Oh, I
That's
didn't
what
hear
you
that.
said.
Is that what you said? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Withdraw the question.
So the movement is in the opposite direction from what you were hypothesizing,
Okay, I withdraw the question.
which is part of what I conclude, why I conclude that Trump maintains an iron grip on the Republican Party,
Okay,
even at the process, even at the cost of shrinking its base.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you, David, for everything. I'm wondering, and I have a feeling you've been asked, and I don't know if you feel it's within the context of our current politics discussion, but what reaction you had to the recent Pew study release?
I'm not sure what study you're referring to, Faye.
It's the newest Pew study on the status of Judaism in the United States.
I must confess I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, maybe we can have a conversation about it at the next meeting. I can send you the link for the information.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
any final thoughts, questions? David, anything else that's coming to your mind that you want to make sure we hold on to?
My mind is fairly depleted.
We appreciate that. We appreciate you. We appreciate all you're given to us this evening. And
Oh,
we are
thank you.
very grateful.
Thank you so much. You're a wonderful audience, even on Zoom.
That's great. That's great.
Okay, good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
Hey,
You're
Care.
quite welcome.
Well,
David,
such
Gonna
a
have an
pleasure,
autographed
David.
book signing, David?
Oh, if it could be arranged, I'd be happy to.
Okay.
Well,
Night.
it will be arranged. We will find a way. We will
Thank
find a way. And we'll get some of that publicity out right after Shavuot, which also should be very interesting. Nice to see everybody. Judy, I'm glad you were able to make it. Bye, Joan. Take care. Thanks, David, a lot.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you all.